And we are aware there's a cost. We know this is happening, but we don't necessarily directly connect all these amazing places that we live in and we work in with the magnitude of the impact that we're having. And I mean, if that is a bit shocking to you, you know, it's surprising, isn't it? Why can't we see this damage? Why can't we connect it to what we're actually designing and building? And carbon is a really funny one because we've had to create this whole concept of embodied carbon because we can't grasp the idea of a colourless, odourless gas being emitted somewhere else as anything to do with what we're building. So we're pretending it's somehow connected to the materials, which, by the way, causes me all kinds of problems because every now and again, people still think that the carbon is in the material. And of course, for timber it is, but other times it's not. And you hear people talking about releasing the carbon at the end of life, which is also a problem. So embodied carbon is not really a great term, but it's one we've had to create to allow us to connect this damage with what we're doing. Now, I think there's a few reasons for why we can't see things. And I think that what we actually have to do, really, is these three things. We need to see, we need to measure, and we need to act. The main part of the book really is about the fact that our brains are frankly a bit lazy. We've evolved to make decisions as quickly as we possibly can. And that means that we filter out things that are unimportant. And we learn what's unimportant. We filter it out so we can make quicker decisions. And of course, all of us here who've gone through lots of training and education, all that's been doing is helping us to focus on what's important and disregard what's unimportant. But the problem is, I think what's unimportant actually is important. And we've learned that these things, these impacts, they're not having a direct feedback loop to what we do. So we're going to have to find a way to unlearn what we've learned and to rethink how we actually consider decisions when it comes to these impacts. And I would say if we don't know where stuff's from, how can we possibly understand the damage and start to measure it? So the key point from this is that we have to ask questions like a child. We have to be prepared to unlearn what we've learned, as I said, and really start asking these questions again. Where do things come from? You know, what's the impact? If we do that, I think we can start to really connect the issues with the materials and things that we're designing. When it comes to a building, there's lots of things that are outside the boundary. You know, all the materials, they're coming from somewhere else. All the fuel's coming from somewhere else. And of course, the waste and the pollution is going outside as well. So the problem is, when we have these theoretical or even literal boundaries, we're disregarding all these things. Now, you could say the obvious answer is to make the boundary bigger, because that makes sense. But how big would it need to be? If we were to actually map out just a typical building and try and work out where do all those things come from, what are the impacts? We really tried to do that, and not just in space, in time as well, because some of these impacts are in the future. We'd end up in a situation where we'd have to consider the entire world in our sort of boundary. And clearly that's not practical. I'm not suggesting we should start doing that. But, you know, it would be an interesting experiment, though, to do on one project. So we're going to have to find a way to expand our boundary, but in a practical way that means we can make better decisions. Because as we move into these other metrics, we're going to have to learn how to deal with different types of information, different types of metrics. The reality is, although I'm always complaining about carbon assessments and the problems with them, carbon is the easiest thing we're going to have to measure in this entire problem. If we look at all the other issues to do with biodiversity or water impact, or even going into society and community, that becomes a lot more difficult. We need to think about the actual place in question. We need to think about relative impacts, and we're going to have to find a way to capture that information in some kind of score, metric, call it what you will. But we actually need to find a way to reconcile all these different impacts and come up with a way to make a decision. And then we get to this really hard part. So how are we going to weigh up the actual decision? On the one hand, we'll have the benefits from our project, you know, to society, to our clients. On the other hand, we're going to have all the potential impact. And we've got to make a decision. You know, what's the right way forward? The good news, though, is that this doesn't necessarily have to be a zero-sum game. The tantalizing prospect of regenerative design is that you can have the benefits of your project and actually a positive impact on society. And that's the light at the end of the tunnel that we need to try and aim for. We're not there yet. I think we've got a long way to go, but it is starting to happen.
When the people in the room are designing the built environment, how can we take some of the items you've talked about to create these turn these chaotic urban landscapes or soundscapes into something that's much more restorative and enjoyable? Can you give us some tips?
So first of all, I think that any place has a story to tell, and the most important thing is to be aware of our impact, first as a human being, and then also with material, with the shape of the architecture. I'm an audio engineer, but then I translate my way to create a message into the art of music, into the sound art. So in my point of view, for example, for the Sound of Venice, it's like a mixture between art, provocation, and also the emotional part of the sound. I guess, the vibration of sound is the first message that our body receives. So really, from a breath, from the footstep on the concrete, the car horns, everything can produce a wonderful sound or a bad sound. So I guess that everything needs to start from the beginning in order to start to learning again how to be polite in our life. And this, it comes naturally into something that can, of course, bring to the design aspect.
There are many ways, and always, in my opinion, they are specific to the place where we are intervening. So there is no recipe that would cover many different questions that could raise in different places, but a context-related analysis and then decisions that are leading to a design and then interventions. This is how I see possible to also urgently address all the pressures that we have, and also to deal with the complex issues that are complex, and we have to get comfortable with this complexity.
I mean, I mentioned the financing because and governance because from the engineering perspective, and I mean, I came back to the point, we know what works and we know what's good. We have a lot of solutions. So I work on water management. We have examples of the cities that are fully circular from the water perspective. Singapore is functioning like that. Singapore is functioning like that because it had to, because it was reliant on the import of water resources, and they wanted to be dependent. They wanted to not be, to increase their resilience to any kind of political decision which may cut off their water resources. And I think comes to your point about COVID. So when there is a need, then things happen. But sustainability and regenerative design is expensive. So I think that's the reality, and what we hear from lots of external organizations that we work with is exactly what you say. There is a minimum compliance, and everything else beyond that is just really expensive, and no one wants to pay. Developers want to make profit, citizens, they don't want to pay too much, and there's like a big societal, socioeconomic context of I think what we are discussing. I personally think the government should take much bigger role in strengthening the regulation, but also then providing resources to implementing the regulation.
I mean, we've spoken before in Ramble in the UK about trying to create T-shaped engineers, which when you think about it is a very linear shape, isn't it? Classic engineering thing to say. But the idea of being broad at the top and then have this deep down. But now thinking about it a bit more, I think actually the notion even of having a shape is probably wrong. We need to be having a much more open notion of what our learning is. And I was just reflecting then that, you know, when I went to university, we had like a humanity option every once a week or something. And, you know, maybe we should be having that in work. Maybe, you know, 10%, 20% of our time should be in a different part of the business or something else, you know, you come in and try things out and rotate.
Well, there are many definitions of regenerative design and what it means. But if we could just select a couple of main points, is seeing what we are doing in dialogue with, what we are doing, built environment, in dialogue with the natural environment without creating this binary friction that Professoressa Andreotti was talking this morning, and seeing natural elements of environment as equal stakeholders in the, if we want to use that terminology, in the design process, equal as it could be developer, as it could be user, or any other community part of the process. So seeing it in a multi-dimensional way from different aspects, from aspects of stakeholders, but also on aspect what effect could have any intervention we are designing on the ground that we are working on the neighborhood, on the wider scale, or on a global even scale.